Welcome everyone to our International Women's Day talk live from our annex. It's the library's 60th and my final online talk as we welcome our speaker Joanna Williams, who is going to speak to us about suffragist, scientist and trailblazer Lydia Becker. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so, and there's a donate button on our website. Okay, and we're just about to share the screen, and we welcome new library manager Belinda, who's going to do that, and then it's over to Joanna. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, perfect, thank you. In fact, can we maybe move this up out of the corner?
Can you move all our pictures down the side? How do we move those? Because our pictures down the side are hiding some of the screen.
I think maybe
That's up to that's up to Miss Lydia Beckers. Yeah. That's her way of looking at it.
right. Don't know if that helps her.
I don't know how to
Put it back.
when they do that.
Valerie,
that is on your screen rather than ours. So you need to sort that for yourself. It'll be in the little hide thumbnail video. You need to do that on your screen.
I'll try.
Okay.
Oh, I've done it. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. Very nice to see all the people here in the room, and also lots of you online, which is super, and thank you for coming along. And I hope I'm going to be able to tell you something a little bit about this remarkable lady, the great Miss Lydia Becker. And this front screen that I've put on tells you some of the more amazing things that happened under her leadership of the suffragist movement in the 1870s and 80s in Britain. I came to write this book because I felt that Lydia Becker had been sadly neglected by popular history. I think many historians who study suffragism are aware of her activity, but they know very little about her. And for most people, they've never even heard of her. Even people who live in Manchester, and she was, after all, a Mancunian. And Mancunians are very proud of their heritage, but we don't meet many people who have heard of Lydia Becker. So what I'm hoping to achieve is to rehabilitate her reputation as one of the great leaders of the women's suffrage movement, and also a great campaigner for other aspects of women's rights as well. She wasn't just a suffragist, she was interested in lots of things that pertained to the position of women in the late 19th century. So I'm not going to go through the things on the board on the screen at the moment, because I will be touching on these anyway during my talk. But if you've just read one or two of them, you'll see that there were some quite amazing things happened because of her leadership. Oops, let me find my thing. So for most people, this lady, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her wonderful statue in St. Peter's Square here, is synonymous with the cause of votes for women. She is the outstanding figure in popular memory. There was a poll in Manchester to decide which woman should be represented in the statue that eventually was put up in St. Peter's Square. Emmeline reached the short list of 6. Lydia Becker didn't even make that. And in the end, in the final vote for those 6, she got 56% of the vote. So that means the other 5 got 44% between them. So it was a massive victory for Emmeline, and that shows you how prominent she is in people's awareness of women's suffrage campaigning. But the suffragettes, that's her particular group, didn't come out of nowhere. And in fact, you could say that they stood on the shoulders of the people who'd gone before them. They stood on the foundations that had already been laid, most notably by Lydia Becker and the people who worked with her earlier on in the 19th century. And this included men as well as women. There were very active male suffragists as well as female. The suffragettes excluded men from their organisation. But the suffragist movement was always one that included men as well. So Lydia Becker was pushing forward the women's suffrage campaign from about 1868 until she died in 1890. And in fact, it was she who, by Emmeline's own admission, inspired Emmeline Pankhurst to become a suffragist. When Emmeline was 14 in 1872, her mother took her along to a suffrage meeting at which Lydia Becker was speaking. And she says in her own autobiography that this inspired her so much that she, from that day on, she was a confirmed suffragist. So we can credit Lydia Becker with having actually inspired her. And also she does say that she read Lydia Becker's journal, the Women's Suffrage Journal, which Lydia founded, edited, was a chief contributor to. She read that at home. So Lydia Becker had a big influence on the young Emmeline Pankhurst. So our earliest, sorry about that. No, it isn't going to do it. Oh, well. Our earliest picture of Lydia is from 1873, photograph of her here. You can see there that she's dressed in a very feminine way, lots of flounces and frills and so on. And one of the reasons for this was that Lydia suffered right from the start from a lot of attacks in the press, both verbal and also cartoons, which made out that she was a manly woman because she wanted women to have the things that men considered to be their right. So the right to vote, but also she went out and made speeches, which women just didn't do at that time. So they accused her of being a manly woman. In fact, it was said by one writer in the newspaper that there are now three sexes, men, women, and Miss Becker. So she was very, very careful always to dress in a very smart and feminine way because she wanted to show that you didn't have to be a manly woman or an unkempt woman to want women to have rights. And this is an example of how she did it early on in life. Later on, her dress became a bit more severe, as we'll see. But this is about 5 years into her campaigning, and she was very nicely dressed as a very feminine image for her. Well, it strikes me that there's nothing really new in some ways about a lot of the issues we're dealing with today in feminism. And some of the things that Lydia Becker had to deal with were very similar to what's going on now. First of all, physical and sexual abuse of women was something about which she campaigned extensively in her journal. She had a special column in it from 1878 that was called Wife Torture. And her friend, Frances Power Cobb, had brought out a pamphlet with the same name. And Lydia had read it and got a lot of the information for her column from the research of Frances Power Cobb into the abuse of women, particularly within marriages. So this was one thing about which Lydia was very indignant and spoke as well as writing about it in her speeches, about the way that women were treated. The subjugation of women within marriage, not only in terms of abuse, but also the fact that women could not own their own property. A woman who married until, well, really the 1880s, but basically had no control over her inheritance, her property, her money. If she had income, she didn't have any control over that. Everything she owned belonged to her husband. This changed a little bit in 1872, when there was a law that gave women the rights over their earnings, but that would only really affect working class women on the whole, because most middle class women didn't go out to work. And then in the 1880s, a further law that actually did give women some control over their property, although it was so complicated that they needed a lawyer to advise them how to actually carry it out. So Lydia campaigned and actually became treasurer of the Married Women's Property Campaign when it was founded in 1868. She also campaigned about unequal pay at work. Women were usually paid half to 2/3 of what men got paid for the same work. And in any case, often were not allowed to do the more skilled jobs. They were reserved for men. The conditions that women worked in, the hours of seamstresses, for example, she interested herself in. And the opportunities they had at work. Of course, there was no opportunities really to become managers or anything like that for women. The unequal standards in education. She was a member of the Manchester School Board for 20 years, and she was very interested in trying to improve the education for all poor children, but she was particularly interested in the education of girls, who got a raw deal compared with the boys even. and the fact that very few girls were studying science. And as a scientist herself, that was her great interest in life apart from the women's movement, she was very keen that girls should be able to study science. And that again is something that we still encounter today, getting girls interested in science. And of course, there were very few women involved in anything to do with politics, any top positions. Women were excluded from all that kind of thing. And again, we're still grappling with those issues today. Not enough women in parliament, not enough women in top positions in business and so on. And the response to her campaigning was very similar in a way. Aggressive attacks on her, which were aimed at humiliation, were commonplace. I mentioned that she dressed smartly and in a feminine way because of these attacks. There were cartoons, and I'll show you some of them, which were very, very unpleasant. And she was very hurt by them. And although my impression is that it wasn't quite as violent a response as it later became and is now, it was for women who were used to being secluded in the home and were just about brave enough to venture out. The fact that they were attacked at all or even mentioned in the press was something that was very, very threatening to them. So relatively, this was a very scary thing to happen. So let's look at Lydia's early life a little bit to understand where she was coming from. This house is still standing. It's family home now, and it's in Altham, which is near Accrington. And this is where most of her life up to her late 30s was spent. She did have about 13 years in Reddish when her family moved there for business purposes. But basically, this is where she grew up. It's in the countryside. It's got a view of Pendle Hill, lovely rolling hills around it. And so it was a rural upbringing. Lydia was the eldest of 15 children, and she was expected to help her mother with the younger children as they came along. So it was a life of domesticity. She didn't get any formal education, except there is a mention in one source that she went to Everton for a year in a boarding school, but we know nothing about that. Didn't make much of an impression, I don't think. But she was informally educated by her mother and really educated herself because she was a voracious reader on lots of different topics. And this is how she became interested in science, in history and politics, all because she initiated reading herself. And she felt very resentful later on that she had been excluded from the opportunities that her brothers had. Her brother Wilfred, for example, when he went off to university, she was very put out that this had never been anything that would have been a possibility for her. She would have loved to have gone and done studying in a university, but that just wasn't possible for a woman at that time. And the family were expecting her really to help with the children, but also when her mother died in 1855, in her 40s, she was then expected to take over the role of mother to the younger children, and was kind of almost designated the daughter who would stay at home and help her father. So she oversaw, for example, her younger sister's weddings and that kind of thing, but she was remaining at home. Now, while she was at Altham, she developed a huge love of the countryside, and she particularly took an interest in botany. This was something that was considered unacceptable for a woman to be interested in botany because it was to do with flowers and pretty things. And indeed, she took painting classes so that she could record the flowers she saw around her in the countryside more accurately. And she also developed a new way of pressing and preserving flowers, which won her a gold medal at the Royal Horticultural Society in 1862. So, she was very, very keen on it. And her uncle, who was a Manchester chemist and doctor, sent her books and advised reading and helped her to develop a scientific approach to botany. And she really wanted to succeed as a scientist. This was, in her early life, what she really hoped to do. And she went out into the fields and meadows and lanes and collected roots and samples of flowers and so on. And during this time, she began a correspondence with Charles Darwin. That went on for 14 years, in which she'd found the red campion, which you can see here. She'd found a red campion, which was a hermaphrodite version. And she wondered whether it was a new species that she'd discovered. But Charles Darwin was of the opinion, and he came around to this in the end after they discussed it extensively and sent each other roots and things, that it was a mutation caused by a fungal infection in the plant. So this correspondence and about that and other things carried on for 14 years, as I say. And this is a photograph of a panel on the door in the sitting room in Altham, in the house, in Moorside House, where she grew up. And it was it's thought that Lydia painted these on the door because she was practicing her painting of flowers. So this is the red campion flowers, and that's just one of the panels on the door. It's got about 6 panels, and they all have red campion flowers painted on them. And it's been preserved to the present day. Well, eventually, her father's business, which I didn't mention, was to do with chemicals for the cotton industry. They were making chemicals for cotton. Fell on hard times because of the American Civil War and the cotton famine in Lancashire, which I'm sure you're aware of. And so the family moved to smoky Manchester, went to live in Manchester and settled in Ardwick, which was quite reasonably salubrious at that time. It was quite a nice area, but it was definitely a step down from where they had been in Altham. And Lydia, well, she'd been in the rural backwater, and she hadn't really experienced much of life in a city. And Manchester, of course, well, what a city Manchester was. Even in the 1860s, it was at the cutting edge of what was going on. The very first, for example, Trade Union Congress was held in Manchester in 1868. So it was cutting edge politically. It was the home of the centre of Chartism in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. It was a radical place, with a lot of radicals in Manchester. And also it was at the cutting edge of technology as well, with mass production, mass workforces, the factories, the warehouses, a place of dire poverty and disease, but also incredible wealth. So it was a really completely different environment to what she'd experienced before. And Lydia realised that in Manchester there were opportunities for science. There was, after all, the Literary and Philosophical Society, which was had been going on for a century by this time. And she, in fact, more than a century at this time. So she decided that she must get involved in this great scientific scene, but she found that all the doors were closed to her because she was a woman. So as a result of this, she decided that she would found her own society, which she called the Ladies' Literary Society. It met in the Royal Institution, the present art gallery. They're given a room there that they could use. And they asked Charles Darwin to send some of his papers for them to read and discuss at their meetings, because these things weren't accessible for women at all. And he duly sent them 3 papers to discuss. It didn't last very long, this organisation, because probably because she became involved in other things very quickly. But she did make a speech which was quite earth-shaking. Lydia had noticed that because the red campion had mutated due to an outside influence, i.e. the fungus, she realised that what Darwin was saying with his writings was that things can change because of outside influences. And she applied this to people, to human beings. And she thought about why, if that applied to plants and animals, why should it not apply to women? And as a plant which is kept in the dark in a corner and not nurtured will grow very stunted, she compared that to what had happened to her and was happening to all the other women, that she had been kept in a corner by not being educated, not being allowed to join societies and so on, and therefore her growth was stunted. And she came to the conclusion that in fact she thought male and female brains were exactly the same, that just because their bodies were different, it didn't mean their brains were different. And she made a speech to the Ladies' Literary Society about this. And this came to the notice of some of the scientific societies. So she was invited to give this speech eventually at the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, it was a very revolutionary thing to speak as a woman in front of any group, but particularly in front of a mixed group of men and women. Now, we have to combine with this the fact that also by this time, Lydia had already attended a thing called the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science, which was a fairly new society, and it encouraged women to participate, whereas the Association for the Advancement of Science didn't really. They kind of grudgingly let them in as long as they had a man with them. But the social science one was much more open. And she had been to that in Manchester, all these opportunities opening up to her. She went to their meeting and heard Barbara Bodichon speak. Barbara Bodichon was one of the chief campaigners in London, and she was speaking about why women ought to have a vote. And Lydia came out of this meeting completely blown away that she'd never thought about these things before. People quite often ask me, had she read any Mary Wollstonecraft or anything like that, any Tom Paine? No, as far as I'm aware, I've never come across any evidence that she'd read anything like that she wasn't really aware of what was going on in London with the Kensington Society and the Langham Place group, who were helping women in various ways to access work and that sort of thing. So she was completely green, really, and she found it absolutely amazing that there were people who, in a way, thought like she did, that women should have more opportunities and should be given the same rights as men. So when she heard Barbara Bodichon speak, she was absolutely amazed and wrote to London saying, can I help? Can I be involved in whatever's going on there? So if we put those two things together, this really set the ball rolling. So in 1866 to 67, she really threw herself with huge enthusiasm into the women's movement that was just embryonic at this time. And she even wrote her own article about female suffrage based on what Barbara Bodichon said, but with her own views and ideas put into it as well, which was published as a pamphlet by the women in London and distributed because they thought it was so good and clear the way she wrote her ideas down. So she very quickly became involved in a small embryonic group in Manchester, and she pushed for it to be turned into the Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage, a Manchester group for women's suffrage. So this was in 1867. Now, obviously, I can't take you blow by blow through the whole of Lydia's life. So what I'm going to do now is show you some of the things in which she involved herself. Key activities, and obviously the main one for her was the women's suffrage movement, because she argued that if women had a vote and all the other things could be put right, that this was the fundamental thing. She called it the root thing, and everything else was branches. So things like married women's property rights and the rights of women at work, all those things would be put right if women had a vote, because the people in Parliament would then have to listen to them and do the things they wanted. So being a suffrage campaigner was her prime thing, and it's the thing she led, whereas other things she got involved in but wasn't the person in the sort of spearheading it. So she was involved in campaigning, in speaking, which, as I've explained, was considered to be almost immoral for a woman to speak, and yet she made oratory her own and became very good at it with practice. And she became the parliamentary secretary of the London branch in the 1880s, when she went down to London and worked there for 10 years, commuting back to Manchester to try and sort of keep her hand in there as well with her duties there. Was actually invited to go to London, as I'll explain later, and became very, very involved in the lobbying of Parliament in the 1880s. Also linked in with this, she proposed a municipal franchise, that in municipal corporations like Manchester, that women should have a vote, and that got passed by Parliament in 1869 through her pushing for it, and Jacob Bright, the MP for Manchester, who was a woman's suffragist and who was president of the Manchester Women's Suffrage Society. He persuaded the proposer of the bill that should be added on as an amendment, and it got passed. So women from 1869 were voting in the council elections in Manchester. And then in 1881, she and a Yorkshire woman called Alice Scatcherd, who has a wonderful description in Lydia Pankhurst's The Suffragette campaign, who says that she was a tall, bony Yorkshire woman who was very unfashionably dressed and wore large, elastic-sided boots. So, and she didn't wear a wedding ring because she believed it symbolised slavery. So she was married to a mill owner, but yeah. So Alice and Lydia set off for the Isle of Man because they heard that there was going to be a reform of the voting system in the Isle of Man, and persuaded the Keys to vote, to allow women to vote in the same terms as men. So from 1881, women in the Isle of Man had the vote in Isle of Man elections. She also became a member of the Manchester School Board in 1870 when it was set up. She was the very first woman in the country to be elected to the school board. And for 20 years, she was its only woman member, 1 woman and 14 men, and was particularly interested in girls' education because of obviously her interest in women's campaigns. I mentioned that she was in the Married Women's Property Campaign. She was the treasurer of that for the first 6 years of its life. The Ladies' National Association, which campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Acts, which were laws that said that any woman who was suspected of being a prostitute could be rounded up and forcibly examined for venereal disease, sexually transmitted diseases, and if found to be suffering from the disease, would be put into a lock hospital, which was like a prison hospital. The one for Manchester was where Spinningfields and all those lovely modern buildings are now. That's where it was. And so they were very, originally there had been a men's association against this, arguing that it was very unfair on women. Why attack the women and leave the men, who they were worried about, who were particularly worried about the armed forces being weakened by this? Why not deal with the men that were involved? Also, any working class woman who had to be in the wrong place at the wrong time could be swept up by the police, didn't have to have any evidence, and taken off, and forcible internal examination just because she looked as if she might be a prostitute, and they didn't really bother to distinguish. So there was a lot of agitation against it. The men formed an association, but women weren't allowed to join it because it was an unsuitable subject for ladies. So they formed their own Ladies' National Association. And she was the treasurer for that. And that led on to the Vigilance Association a little bit later, which was involved in defending women's rights and trying to stop excesses of the law, like the Contagious Diseases Act. She also campaigned particularly to protect the working class women's rights at work. She was very in favour of cooperatives because it would give women a chance to engage in commerce. And also protecting the women's rights, as I've mentioned already, people who were very badly paid and had terrible working conditions like seamstresses. And then finally, the Women's Suffrage Journal, which she founded, she edited, she contributed to it most commonly as a chief contributor, and in fact, to some extent financed it as well, even though she never had that much money, but she did fork out for that. And that was something that was read widely across the country. It was a very, very big publicity machine for all the women's movements, not just the suffrage. It was called Suffrage Journal, but it had articles about everything in it that was to do with the women's movement, and it was very influential in its time. As I've mentioned, it influenced Emmeline Pankhurst herself. So those are all the areas in which she became involved. Obviously, I think it's important to stress that she didn't do all this on her own. There were other women who were quite prominent. Elizabeth Wolston-Elmy was a very close friend for 6 years. And in fact, Elizabeth says that they wrote hundreds of letters to each other, most of which sadly have not survived, which was a great pity. And they worked together in particular the married women's property movement. And that's what Elizabeth was interested in, as well as other things to do with married women's rights over children, that kind of thing. Josephine Butler was a Liverpool campaigner who worked on behalf of prostitutes in Liverpool. She was the leader of the opposition to the Contagious Diseases Act, the Ladies' National Association. Now, Lydia was very keen that both these women should drop these, what she called branch interests, and focus more on the suffrage, because she believed that was more important. And particularly Josephine Butler, who she regarded as being a sort of perfect lady. Josephine was married, she had children, so she was kind of like unassailable in the eyes of people who might be less sympathetic to what were regarded as aggressive spinsters like Lydia Becker. She was a married woman, she was very beautiful, very gentle manner, a good speaker, and Lydia really wanted her on side and wrote her letters, telling her to drop the secondary issue of contagious diseases or whatever, and join her in agitating for the suffrage. And Josephine got rather annoyed with her at times. At one point, Josephine had quite a lot of illness, and Lydia got very impatient with this. And she said at one point, "Well, I have been back, and I hope I'm working hard enough for the Becker now." The Becker. Frances Power Cobb was a friend slightly later in life. She's a little bit unusual because, as a women's suffragist, she was a conservative supporter. Most of them were liberals. But Frances Power Cobb specialised particularly in investigating the abuse of women within marriage and She was the one that produced the pamphlet about wife torture. So Lydia wasn't on her own. I think it's important to stress, she wasn't doing it all single-handedly. There were other very able women involved in the campaign. But with the suffrage campaign, she was the spearhead. Also, the men in the movement. And this young lawyer was very, very important to Lydia. In fact, Sylvia Pankhurst did suggest that there might have been some romantic attachment. He was 7 years younger than Lydia. But Lydia certainly was very taken with him. She wrote a lot about him in her letters in the late 1860s and was incredibly impressed by his abilities in campaigning with her for women's suffrage. And later on, even in 1883, when he was campaigning for Parliament himself, and somebody shouted out, heckled, "Who is Richard Pankhurst?" Somebody else answered, "Miss Becker's sweetheart." So there was definitely a kind of rumour mill going that there was a bit of romantic interest. And maybe there was, it wouldn't have surprised me in a way. Lydia did like the idea of getting married. I don't think anybody ever asked her. I think she was probably a bit scary. But she always said she would never marry anybody who didn't treat her as an equal. Well, if you know anything about Richard Pankhurst, you'll know that when he married Emmeline, he definitely treated her as an equal. They were very much an equal partnership in their marriage, as far as we can tell. Maybe she did have some romantic inclinations, but anyway, it came to nothing. But he was hugely important in the early movement. Now, all this agitation had a kickback. We're just going to look at one or two of these cartoons. There are quite a lot of them. And it does tell you how important Lydia Becker was in people's thinking at that time, that they bothered to make up cartoons about her. So here we've got one. This is about the election in 1868, the general election. Lydia there in the middle, quite well dressed as usual with her flounces and things, but she's just about to do something very unfeminine, which is beat a man. And that's Jacob Bright, another very important male suffragist, president of the Manchester Society. And he's doing something extremely effeminate, which would have been regarded as being a very unmanly thing to do, and that was a bad thing at that time, which is pushing babies in a pram. And the babies represent women's rights. There's always plays on words, keep up your pecker, you can see where that comes from. And then behind Lydia, the committee, the Manchester Committee, all cheering her on in her aggressive behaviour towards Jacob. And she's saying, "No seat from me, sir, without my pets, my supporting my women's rights pets." If you look carefully, you can see that this is a very demeaning view of the women. The women on the committee are all looking rather ugly. And do you notice that pretty much all those women are showing their ankles? That's not ladylike. These are not proper women. These are uncouth women. And that's how they're presented. Now, Lydia found these things really hurtful. Although she put up a very sort of severe appearance, the portrait that I put on the front of my book by Susan Isabel Dacre, which is in Manchester Art Gallery, I think gets to the heart of how vulnerable she was. She really was hurt by these things and she hated seeing them. This one's from Punch, so this is national. And we can see on the left there, John Bull, the redoubtable symbol of old England and English farming conservatism, holding the door of Parliament shut while the women's rights campaigners are battering on it. And Lydia there in the front, you would always recognise her because she's wearing her steel-rimmed spectacles. Again, showing ankles. None of them look particularly prepossessing of the face. And then you've got at the back, I like this touch, I think this is really interesting. The nice ladies, the proper ladies, all just showing a tiny little toe. And the little girl pointing and saying, what are those ladies doing, mummy? And they're sort of embarrassed, this isn't something a little girl should see, trying to, get past without looking at them. And this is obviously the point that this isn't what nice ladies do. Sorry, I'm going to jump more. There we are. This is the 1876 election, I think, when Jacob Bright got back into Parliament. He'd lost his seat for a couple of years. And you look at that donkey, it's got spectacles and a lace collar. That's Lydia Becker. And in fact, it's on its back, it's a school mistress, referring to her school board role. schoolmistress Becker. So that's her. So riding on the back of Miss Becker, he gets back into Parliament. Again, it's this implication and this strange relationship and this humiliation of Lydia. In fact, there was a racehorse named after her as well at this time. So another example of how she was demeaned and they were attempting to humiliate her. And this one, again, this is from Fun magazine, National Satirical magazine. Lydia Becker there in boxing gloves, again, unfeminine. She's about to punch John Bright. Now, John Bright is on a pedestal because he's like, you know, the doyen of the radicals by this time. And in 1876, when this was produced, he'd made an anti-women's suffrage speech, which had really, they felt, set them back a lot, because he was supposed to be a radical. He'd agitated for years for working class men to have the vote. And yet he didn't want women to have the vote. He didn't think that was right. And many people in his family, his sister even, and his brother Jacob, that was his younger brother, were very much suffragists. So he was out on a limb in his family. But he'd made this speech. So this is showing Lydia about to punch him. And it says, with a respectful remembrance of other women with other and better ways. So in other words, again, it's this, you shouldn't be doing it that way. It's not the right way to behave for a woman. And I've just picked out a few. There are lots more of those. So, in 1881, Lydia had a letter from this lady, Lauraclaren. She was actually the daughter of the mayor of Salford and his wife, the Pochins, who were very, very keen suffragists and had been very friendly with Lydia Becker. And Laura married and went to London, and she joined the London Committee. And she wrote a letter to Lydia Becker in 1881 saying, we really need you in London because Manchester is the lead in the campaign, and we need it to be in London, and you will bring the lead to London if you come and work with us in London. At this time, the Liberal government were thought to be about to bring in a law that would give working class men in the countryside, the farm workers, the better off ones, the vote. And it was thought a great opportunity to put an amendment into Parliament to give women the vote at the same time. Women with property, on the same terms as the men. So Lauraclaren and her committee decided to invite Lydia to come and be the honorary secretary of the London Committee so that they could then have the lead of the whole suffrage campaign through her. And after negotiations and discussions, she went to London. And for the rest of her life really, 9 years, she was working particularly actively in London. She had been to London a lot before. She'd been down to visit MPs, to lobby ministers. She'd been in London making speeches on numerous occasions. So it wasn't as if she never went, but her base had been in Manchester. Now her base was transferred to London, and she was working through the London Committee. It wasn't an entirely smooth transition. There were some people, powerful people, Helen Taylor, for example, John Stuart Mill's stepdaughter. He died in 1873, but she was still quite powerful. She didn't agree with Lydia Becker coming down to London. And so it was controversial, but Lydia set off and took up residence in Langham Place in London and was active there from then on. And she became their chief lobbyist in Parliament. She was always in Parliament, or actually there was a group of MPs who were in favour of women's suffrage, and she coordinated with them and liaised with them, and was very, very active in the London Society and in Parliament, a very familiar figure in the corridors of Parliament. So this was an important move for her and for the campaign. This is a picture of her later in life, the year before she died. And there is a quotation. I thought it was particularly nice that there's this photograph which is from the collection of her very close comrade in London, Helen Blackburn, which is now in Girton College Library in Cambridge. But there is also a letter in the LSE from Frances Mary Stirling in 1941. So she's describing something that happened a long time before, 50, 60 years before, but it sums up this picture. She says, my first suffrage meeting at St James's Hall in London was a real sight. Becker, to make the chief speech, boiled down and poured into tight black satin, tight to bursting point. And I think that's what we can see here. She's wearing the dress into which she was poured in the time when Frances Mary Stirling saw her. And hair scragged off a hideous forehead. And Miss Blackburn and Miss Biggs, one each side of the platform, holding up a long banner with a noble sentiment on it. Oh my, that you could have been there to see. But it was a good and enthusiastic meeting. It must have been to have weathered such a sight. We laughed over it for years after at home. So this is a suffragist who thought this was funny to see them on the stage looking like this. But I thought it was rather nice that we've got this photograph kind of tied it up quite neatly with how she looked later in life. Well, why is Lydia Becker important then? I think she changed the political climate. There were triumphs along the way. I mentioned in the very first slide that, for example, there was a campaign that found a loophole in the law that allowed up to 1,000 women to actually vote in the 1868 general election. The Isle of Man, women got the vote on the same terms as men. The municipal vote, which Lydia actually was very active, encouraging working class women in Manchester particularly to use the vote. She held meetings specially for them to tell them what they could achieve by it, bathhouses, libraries, things that women wanted for their families, and also how they could go about it, what they had to do to register. All these things were foreign to women, so she was very active with that. But I think there were several ways in which she really pushed things on, and when I said she laid the foundations for the later suffragists, this kind of is where we're at now. Women's oratory became accepted, a commonplace even. It undermined their separate spheres where women had to stay at home and men went out into the world. She worked very hard to reach working class women. She was delighted when she could get working class women to go out and vote in 1868. Quite a lot of the women who voted in that general election were ordinary women who happened to be householders and therefore had the qualification in terms of property. Women voters in local elections, she actually was always wanted a woman on the school board with her. That was quite a lonely thing, being the only woman amongst all those men, even though some of them were quite sympathetic to her suffrage ideals. But she was encouraged, Mrs. Roby, for example, who was also a suffragist, to join her, but Mrs. Roby wouldn't stand. But she encouraged women to get elected in other places to school boards and to stand for poor law guardianships as well. The women's suffrage was kept on the agenda for everybody. They presented either a bill or a resolution every single year from 1870 to 1890, except 1874, because Jacob Bright lost his seat and it was a bit of a mess that year. But the issue was kept very much alive. And I think perhaps even more important than all that, and part of all that, was the fact that at the beginning, in 1870, when they were debating the very first women's suffrage bill in Parliament, it had been laughed at. It was considered ridiculous. In fact, one MP even compared giving women the vote to teaching dogs to dance. You know, it was ridiculous and unnatural, was the view. By the time that she died in 1890, they were seriously discussing the issue of women's suffrage. It wasn't laughed out of Parliament anymore. And in fact, there were several people in the know who said that they thought that it was a question really, rather than if women would get the vote, when they would get the vote. And that was accepted grudgingly by some and happily by others, but that it was only a matter of time that it would happen. And there were several occasions when it came very close, but for various reasons, which I go into in the book, but we don't have time to discuss at great length here, they didn't manage to get it through. But there were times when people thought that it was going to pass. It looked very, very likely. So they got really close, and it's very frustrating, you know, so near and yet so far, of course, is the phrase that springs to mind. So it's important that she did change the political climate with her colleagues. Well, in 1890, she had a rather sad and sudden and lonely death, really. She hadn't been very well for a few months before she died in July of 1890. And she decided to go for a rest cure to Bath and did improve. So then she decided she would travel on the continent. This wasn't something she'd never done. As a teenager, she'd gone to Germany to visit a relative because her grandfather came from Germany, hence the name Becker. And she had travelled to Germany before. So she decided she would go and take the waters and the air and go and get a rest cure abroad. And she ended up in Aix-les-Bains in France, quite close to Switzerland, where she contracted diphtheria, unfortunately. She was doing quite well, but then she suddenly became very ill. And it was recommended to her that she travel to Geneva to consult a specialist. And that was a 5-hour journey in a carriage over bumpy roads. It must have been hell. And she had a maid with her. And she wrote to the maid, "I don't think I'm going to survive the journey." She couldn't speak because she was so ill. She did arrive though, and she was turned away from several hotels because she looked so ill, they wouldn't take her in. Eventually found a clinic and saw a doctor, but died before anything could be done, sitting up in an armchair in the middle of the night. And really, that was very, very sudden and had developed over just a few days. So it was a really sudden death. A telegram was sent home, well, a couple actually, one by the maid and one from the doctor. The maid wrote, "Poor Miss Becker is no more," to her brother. And the doctor wrote, "Miss Becker is dead," in French. These telegrams arrived to her brothers. Wilfred, in particular, received them. And two of her brothers set off and arrived in time to see her buried in the graveyard of Saint Georges in Geneva. And as far as I can find, there is no marker for that grave, but that's where she was buried. There are all the documents paying for it and everything. They're extant in the LSE collection. They commemorated her, though, on the family grave. You can see her name there right at the bottom, but they got the age wrong because they put she was 64, but in fact she was 63. But, you know, these brothers were 20 odd years younger than her, so probably know entirely how old she was. Well, when she died, there was great consternation. It was a big shock. And the suffrage movement was very running around like headless chickens, really. They were, didn't know what to do with the Women's Suffrage Journal, what to do about the campaigns that she was still running, even from her sickbed, sending letters. And she even called in on her way to Aix-les-Bains in London to a committee meeting. So, she was still very active right to the end. And they felt really lost. And even the people who had fallen out with her, and there were quite a number of them by this time, wrote, how important she'd been in the women's suffrage movement. Now, Priscilla Maclaren, whose quotation is here, was actually a good friend of hers. She was the leader of the Edinburgh Women's Suffrage Group, and she had misgivings about how Lydia was throwing her weight around in London and was not entirely happy about her power, the amount of power that she had over the London Committee when she went down there in the 1880s. But she didn't fall out with her. But unfortunately, several of the other people that she had worked with all through fell out with her over issues like whether they should explicitly include married women in bills to give women the vote. Lydia came round to the opinion that actually it was a good idea to do it in steps. And first of all, try and get the vote for single women and widows, and then work on the married women issue. She also fell out with other people about whether the women's suffrage movement should affiliate with the Liberal Party, because she wanted it to be non-party, and there were quite a lot of conservative women's suffragists like Frances Power Cobb. So she didn't agree with that. So there were breakups and bust-ups and breakaway groups and things by the time she died. So when Priscilla wrote her assessment, she wrote lots of nice things about Lydia, but she also included this quotation from the commemorative issue of the Women's Suffrage Journal. I'll just give you a moment to read what she said. So Lydia fell out with Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy, the Pankhursts, the Jacob Brights, lots of people who had been her close comrades in early years. But she did make new friends in London and close colleagues, Helen Blackburn I've mentioned. I think these breakups were really, again, she was quite vulnerable. And although she didn't seem to be able to keep friendships with people she didn't agree with, she was so passionate about her beliefs that if somebody really disagreed with her, she found it really hard to stay friends with them. And so this is what Priscilla refers to. And I think when you see the vulnerability of her portrait, which I'll show you at the end, by Dacre, you can see that vulnerability in the portrait. But she did make new friends, and some very powerful ones. And one of the people who consistently backed her in London was Millicent Fawcett, who of course became the leader of the suffragist groups after Lydia's death, and was the leader of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the suffragists, who continue to work for the vote. And many historians attribute to them equal weight in getting women the vote with them as they do with the suffragettes, and some even think that they were more important, but they have been, as we'll see, overshadowed. So I'll just give you a moment to read what Millicent said about Lydia. So I think Lydia recognised that, that Millicent recognised that Lydia had made a huge contribution in pushing things on. And it was unreasonable to expect that they would actually move it so far that women would actually get the vote. But she says, you know, this is success. This isn't failure. And consistently, they became quite good friends. For example, Millicent and Lydia exchanged botanical specimens. Millicent sent Lydia root of hellebore, and Lydia sent Millicent pressed flowers and things like that. So they were quite close. And whenever there was an argument in the London Committee, Millicent always supported Lydia. So they were great allies as well. So why have we forgotten Lydia Becker then? That's the next question, is if she was so important. Well, I think there are several reasons, but the main things, I look at those, the last 3 bullet points really. One of them was the fact that the suffragettes changed the tactics. So the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, founded 13 years after Lydia died in 1903 by the Pankhursts. They abandoned the peaceful approach that had been used to date, although Millicent and the suffragists carried on with it. But obviously, it was a much better copy for newspapers if you've got people smashing windows and chaining themselves to railings and burning down houses and so on, than just going and making speeches. That had been militant in its day. In the 1860s and 70s, making a speech, a woman making a speech was militancy. It changed its meaning. It had to become more violent to make an impact, and that's what the suffragettes did. And rather than try to persuade the government, which the suffragists were doing, they decided that to try and make Britain ungovernable, that they would make life too difficult for them and they just have to change things whether they agreed with it or not. So the change of tactics was just the thing that became interesting to people. Secondly, the Pankhursts were great at self-publicising, and Sylvia particularly dismissed the early movement. She said Lydia Becker was on the whole a narrowing influence, that she had not had great gifts of oratory, that she wasn't very intelligent, all of which I think is extremely unfair. But Sylvia was never an unbiased observer of anything, really. I mean, you know, her works are extremely interesting and tell us a lot, but you always have to remember this is Sylvia, and she was very, very passionate and couldn't really extract her own feelings out of things very, very often. And I think she was particularly keen to publicise the work that the suffragettes had done in getting women to vote. And Emmeline was much more appreciative of what the early suffragists had achieved. She did recognise that in her writings, although it was kind of ghost written, but presumably she approved of what went into it. And obviously, thirdly, Becker's goal was to achieve women's suffrage in national elections, and she didn't achieve that. It probably wasn't a reasonable goal to have in the time that she had to do it. But it became overshadowed. It happened on the watch when the suffragettes were the dominant, most powerful and most well-known group. And therefore, it was put down to them because it happened when they were around. And I think those are the main reasons why we have forgotten Lydia Becker. There are other things to do with losing support and splits, but there were lots of splits in the suffragette movement. They fell out with loads of people. So, you know, it doesn't explain it on its own. So this is the portrait to which I was referring, the Dacre portrait in the Manchester Art Gallery. And Emmeline Pankhurst, I've called my book The Great Miss Lydia Becker. That comes from what Emmeline said about her in her autobiography. And she went on to say, a splendid character and a truly eloquent speaker. She compared her to the Susan B. Anthony. She said she was the Susan B. Anthony of the British movement. Now, Susan B. Anthony was one of the leading women's suffrage campaigners in America. And she was a great mover and shaker. And that's what she meant when she said she was like Susan B. Anthony. She was the mover and shaker in the women's suffrage movement in her own day. The work of Lydia Becker was picked up by Millicent Fawcett and Emmeline Pankhurst. And it seems to me that she has been overshadowed ever since. And the way our media works, they tend to sort of pick up on one thing, and everybody picks up on the same thing and runs with it. And I just think it's time that she was recognised in the pantheon of great women campaigners, because I think she deserves a place there. Nobody's written her biography. She's the only leading women's suffrage campaigner, even from her own time. There's one for Elizabeth Wollstonecraft now. There's one for Josephine Butler. But there isn't one for Lydia Becker, but there is now, because I've written one. I hope that, I try to redress the balance a little bit for her. Well, that concludes my remarks, but I'm very happy to take any questions that anybody would like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to get an echo, so I won't talk much, but does anybody in the room want to ask or comment? Ask a question or comment?
No.
May I ask how Lydia...
Can you speak quite loudly?
Shall I repeat the question?
Oh, yes, okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
May I ask how Lydia supported herself?
Oh, that's a good question, yes. How did Lydia support herself? Well, with great difficulty, actually, most of the time, because the family had lost quite a lot of their money due to the cotton famine. She always said she wished that she was richer so that she could do all the things she wanted to do. She, particularly in the early years when the suffrage campaign was only just beginning in 1868, for example, she complained that she ran out of money and she could have done more if she'd had more money. So when she was getting women to sign up to register to vote in the 1868 general election, she got quite a lot of the women in Manchester to sign up, but she had to stop when there were about 1,000 or two more to visit, and they hadn't been able to do it because she was paying people. There were so many, she couldn't do it all on her own. So she couldn't do that. So how she did get money was, well, interestingly, she didn't want to be salaried by Manchester or London when she went there, by the committees. She wanted it to be that she was working as a labour of love. But she did accept money from them as a sort of gratuity and to help towards expenses, that kind of thing. It's ironic in a way, because one of the ways in which progressive women then were increasingly criticised if they took paid work. And yet she didn't want to be doing paid work. She was old-fashioned enough, I think, to feel that wasn't how she wanted to be seen. Anyway, so she accepted small sums like, £40. It wasn't a particularly small sum, but when you think of the amount she was doing, it was a small sum. She accepted that one year, for example, from the Manchester Committee. We don't know how much they gave her in lump sums here and there, because we don't have the records of the bank accounts. We have the sort of end of year accounts, but that's all. So, but it wasn't very much from the committees. She got some money from translating documents and articles into English from German, because when she visited Germany as a teenager, one of the things she did there, she was there for a year, she learned German from the local pastor. So when she came back, she earned a couple of pounds here and there translating articles for journals and things like that. But again, not a huge amount. And she also got newspapers. The Manchester Times paid her when she went to abroad to the National Association, no, sorry, it was the BAA, the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which had a meeting in Canada in 1884, had their conference there, and she persuaded them to pay her to be their reporter on site on all the meetings. And so she earned, and she stayed with some relatives that got there. So she saved money by staying with the relatives, and she was paid for that. So it was all done very hand to mouth, really. She did try to, she lived under her father's roof until he died in 1877. But for a short time in the late 1860s, she moved out into digs in Greenhays in Manchester. But she told her friend that she had very little to live on, and she had no bed to sleep in, had to sleep on a chair. And she quite quickly was back in his house. By the time we get to the census in 1871, she was living with her father again. And it was only after he died that she actually got her own little house on Shrewsbury Street, which is in Old Trafford. The house isn't there now, but you know, she really couldn't afford to move out, basically. So yes, it was very hand to mouth, and everything she had, she spent on the cause.
Thank you. We've got Alistair you have your hand up. Can you unmute yourself?
Hi, thanks, Joanna. A fascinating, in-depth analysis. You mentioned, I think it was the Mayor of Salford. Did she, in her early years, get any notable support from people within local government in the Manchester area?
Yeah, well,
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Did she get much support from people in the Manchester area? And thinking particularly of mentioned the Mayor of Salford. Yeah, she did. She had lots of support. She herself said that Manchester people were very much in favour of women's suffrage. And in fact, in Salford, both the Conservative Committee and the Liberal Committee for the candidate in 1868 supported women voting. The Mayor of Salford, Henry Poachin, and his wife Agnes were both very active in the women's suffrage movement. And in Manchester, women were escorted by the representatives of the political parties, of the agents of the candidates. In Salford, were escorted by the agents to vote. So there was a lot of support there. And it was Manchester as a city the council was approached every year when there was a women's suffrage bill in Parliament to voice its support for it. And the Manchester Council voted to support it every year. So there was a lot of support there. I mean, there was no such thing as there is now, opinion polls and things like that. It was all very much anecdotal and, people's impression. But certainly, Manchester was a radical city by tradition. And Lydia and the other suffragists felt very encouraged that Manchester was very supportive, certainly in the ways that we can measure. There would have been a lot of anti-suffragists in Manchester as well at this time because it was such a novel thing, really. But there was quite an extensive, the Manchester Suffrage Society always had very large meetings and a large membership, and wasn't as rich as the London Society, but then they fixed their membership fee at anything you could afford, whereas the London Society insisted on a minimum of £1 to belong, which was too much for a lot of people. That's why Manchester went for anything you could afford. And so they had, quite a sizable membership, and their meetings were well attended. So it suggests that Manchester was very supportive. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Does anybody else on Zoom want to wave at me with a question or a comment? We've had some nice thanks in the chat, which I will forward to you, Joanna. All right, okay. Hang on a moment. I'll just sort of run through. We've got somebody called who is a Wolstenholme, and so very pleased to see the statue being unveiled yesterday in Congleton, which another of our people on Zoom went to see. Elizabeth Wolstenholme, Elmy's statue. That's something that you can read about on our blog, because the people who were involved in that statue campaign wrote about her a couple of years ago. And Lois points out there's a Lydia Becker committee room in the Manchester City Council Education offices on Deansgate. This used to have an information board about her at one time. I think that now is not. I think that's now a restaurant on the ground floor. So I'm not sure. Not sure that's still accessible. Right. Let me find Valerie. If you are waving at me, right, Valerie, I'm going to ask you to unmute. No, I'm not.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. I'm ashamed to say, this is a history teacher. I didn't know about this lady. But I've really to say thank you, and it was superb, and etc. But to tell you, because you may know or you may not know, that tonight, excuse me, my throat, Eccles History Society meeting is about the other lady, Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy. And so I've made the odd note here, and I'll be able to throw a bit in on that, I hope. I think that'll be really, really so interesting that you and this other meeting are falling today. Thank you. So perfect.
Yes.
I think that's probably our boss lady organising it, but it was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, well, I hope you enjoyed the meeting. She's an interesting character, Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy, and got into very hot water because she was living with a man by whom she became pregnant when she was 40, and they were kind of more or less forced by Ursula Bright, Jacob Bright's wife, to go and get married, because neither of them believed in it really, but because she was worried what would happen to the reputation of the movements in which Elizabeth Wollstonecraft was involved, and they reluctantly did get married. But even so, there was a great scandal, as you can imagine, in the 19th century. Middle-class lady, she had a school, you know, she was an educationalist. So yes, it was quite a, well, Sylvia describes it in her book as a fluttering in the dovecote.
Well, if anybody wants to go, it's at 7:30 at St Andrew's Church in Eccles.
Can you all hear that?
Yes, we can always all hear Valerie. Thank you very much, Valerie. You can tell Valerie used to be a teacher, can't you? Thanks, Valerie. Does anybody else want to, either in the room or on Zoom, want to wave at me? I can't see quite so many of you on my iPad, so you'll need to keep waving if you want to. I think we might have rolled to the end, so I will move on to that seat if that's okay. Thank you. Thank you so much to Joanna. Most of the applause is obviously muted, but it's fantastic how many experts we have who have come in and talked to us. As I said, this is our 60th talk, and it has been brilliant. The topics that have been covered and the expertise and enthusiasm which Joanna and the other 59 speakers have brought to it.
Thank you.
It's a terrific thing. So check our website and Facebook page for details of future events, including folk singer Johnny Campbell, who will be singing about the right to roam live on our library stairs on Wednesday the 23rd of March at 2 o'clock. You can get a ticket for that to be here in person, or it will also be live streamed on Zoom. So today's talk has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, and we'll be putting the link on the event webpage.
Could you mention the book as well for me, please?
Yes, just before I sign off, yes, you didn't do the plug for your book.
I didn't know.
Yes, we have copies of the book available for sale here, but do please look out for Joanna Williams, the great Miss Lydia Becker, and get it from an independent bookshop or by other means. And yes, we would certainly encourage you to do that. Thank you for prompting me with that. You were too bashful to do this.
I forgot.
So yes, a reminder that our talks are free, and there is a donate button on our webpage if you would like to express your appreciation, and we do in our turn appreciate those of you who are regulars who do that regularly. We do note that, and it's very kind of you. So, as my voice gives out rather appropriately, thanks again, and one final time from me. Goodbye. Take care. In solidarity. All the best from everybody at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thank you so much for what you've done.